Okay. So tonight we're going to be talking about different tools that exist to research your landlord. And as we go through, if you have a question along the way, feel free to drop it in chat, or if the device you're using doesn't allow you to do that, you can put up your hand. I'm going to ask the Cooper Square staff just to keep an eye on the chat and on the call, since I can't see everything while I'm sharing my screen. If it's a clarifying question, I'll try to answer those as we go. If it's a more detailed question, there's going to be a time at the end just for question and answer and for people to talk about their experiences in their building with their landlord and neighbors. So I am Mike Grinthal. I'm a tenant lawyer. I've been a tenant lawyer in New York since 2007. I currently work at TakeRoot Justice, which is a nonprofit legal services provider. We work with tenants and others who are organizing to dismantle racial, economic, and social oppression. And we are always glad to work with Cooper Square because of the excellent organizing that you all do and the deep roots and all the great leaders who have fought to keep Lower Manhattan a place where there's still some trace of the communities that have lived there in the past. So, what can we learn by researching our landlords and our buildings? So, we can learn who is actually our landlords, since most of the time our buildings are owned by corporations, and even those corporations are often owned by other corporations. We can find who are the human beings behind it, where they are, how we can get in touch with them, other buildings that are owned by them. We can also find out what city agencies have to say about the building, code violations that they've placed, histories of work that's gone on in the building, certificate of occupancy, information about the mortgage and the bank and the financing, information about what money the owner owes to the government as property taxes or civil penalties. You can learn the rent history of your own apartment and its rent regulated status. And you can also find out what kinds of litigation your landlord has been in housing court or when they've been sued in other places, and what kinds of arguments they've made there, all of which helps us put together a picture of how we can reach our landlords, what kinds of landlords they are, how they operate, what else they're doing, what their financial interests are, and also helps us to do our own research on whether our apartments are rent stabilized or rent controlled, whether they're subject to subsidies like J51 or 421A, and especially whether we might be covered by good cause if we're not covered by any of the others. So we're going to go over a bunch of tools that will help us uh, look into all of these things. So the first one we're going to look at, you're probably familiar with, Housing Preservation and Development, which is the agency that, among other things, enforces the housing code, has a website, HPD Online. And by the way, Cooper Square will be sharing these slides. So as we go through and you see web addresses here, don't worry about copying them down or getting them right because we'll share the slides and you'll be able to click right through. So the HPD website is super useful. It has a lot of information in it. Right here is a sample of what the list of open housing code violations for a building looks like. And you'll see it gives you a brief description of the violation, when it was placed, where in the building it is, and whether it's an A, B, or C violation, which is a measure of how serious it is. So you can look this up by your building and you can filter it by apartment. You can also see the history of all the complaints made to 311, even those that never resulted in a violation being placed. You can also find the name and contact information of the owner, since they're required to register that every year with HPD, and there's got to actually be a real human somewhere in there, as well as an actual address where you can go and find them, and not just a PO box. A lot of landlords list a PO box or just the apartment building itself, but the law says they're supposed to actually be listing an address where you can go and find people. You can also find any history of HPD suing the landlord over code violations or any history of tenants suing the landlord over code violations and whether any of those cases are still going on and what they were about. And then finally, HPD has scans of something called an iCard. Um, okay, so this is what the owner information looks like. Any building with 3 units or more has to be registered, and it has to contain this information. So the corporate owner, but also a managing agent, meaning a person who actually can be in touch, who you can be in touch with. The head officer, meaning the person who runs the corporation, or at least one of the people who runs the corporation, and an address where you can find them. This is what the litigation history looks like. If you click on this, you can see just down the left are the types of cases that people have brought. These are for people who are familiar with HP actions. So these are cases brought in housing court for repairs. So you can see that there's in this building, there's a heat and hot water case brought in 2023. Comprehensive is when HPD brings an overall case for everything wrong in the building. In 2021, tenants brought an action and so on. And you can see whether those uh, cases are still open and whether they resulted in a judgment against the landlord. So you can get a sense of what the landlord's track record is. This is an iCard. And what it is, you have to go back a little bit in time. Uh, Buildings built now are required to have a certificate of occupancy, but that wasn't always the case historically, and a lot of buildings uh, don't have certificates of occupancy because they were built before a certain date, or their certificate of occupancy only goes back, say, to the 70s or the 60s. So the iCard is what the city used before there were certificates of occupancy, and it was basically these literal paper cards that would record some basic information about the building and every time that it was altered. And these are all scanned, and you can find them on the HPD website. So this is a way of kind of looking into the sort of the ancient history of your building. They're not always that easy to read because they're all handwritten. But for this one, for example, looking on the lower left corner, you can see a section called alteration plans, and you can see the date filed. So, for example, you can first of all see that the building here at least dates back to 1937, and probably further. You can see that there's been a number of alterations since then. And this can help us piece together the histories of buildings, how old they are, and whether they are still in the same configuration that they were when they were built. Okay. And I should say, I didn't show the home screen for HPD, but when it comes up, it's pretty user friendly. All of these things are laid out where you can see them and you can, you just click on them to get more details. Along with HPD, Department of Buildings is the other major agency tasked with enforcing codes for buildings. And they enforce the building code, which is more of the structural and layout configuration rules that govern buildings. And like HPD's website, you can see history of violations, including ones that aren't open anymore. You can see the history of complaints that have been made, including the ones that didn't result in violations. You can see If you look on the left side of this little image and about halfway down, it says jobs filings. So you can see all of the permit applications, all of the filings that the landlord or any other owner ever filed to do. And on the right, you can see some more specialized things, elevators, plumbing, etc. And this can, uh, number one, you can look and see what violations are open now, what violations there were in the recent past, but you can also get a picture of how the building's been changed. So when you look at permit applications, you can often find brief descriptions of what work was done, what parts of the building, how extensive it was, did it include electrical changes, plumbing changes. And these are especially useful because when we're talking about rent stabilized apartments, we're often trying to figure out the work history of the building because the landlord will often have taken rent increases based on supposed apartment improvements. And so when you see that in your rent history, which we'll get to in a bit, that there was a big jump in rent in, say, 2009, and DHCR says that's because they made some improvement to your apartment, you can go over to the Department of Buildings website and you can see if anything was done at that time in 2009, say, that was big enough to require a permit. So you can get a sense of just how accurate and truthful the DHCR rent history might be. You can also see the building's certificate of occupancy, if there is one. And the certificate of occupancy is basically just a simple statement of what kind of units are in the building, right? Like there are 10 apartments and 2 stores, right? And you can, of course, look at that and compare that to what you see around you and see whether the owner might be violating the certificate of occupancy. This is what a certificate of occupancy might look like. It's a scan of something that's on paper at the DOB headquarters. It's not always easy to read, but you can see how it's broken down by story of the building and how many units there are on each floor. And if there have been changes, there may be more than one certificate of occupancy on file on the website. You could look at them and, like with the iCard, get kind of a story of how the building has changed in the past. Okay, so changing gears, uh, Acris is a database and a website that is maintained by, I believe, the Department of Finance. But what it is that by law, anytime certain things happen with a building, anytime the building, the ownership changes, so there's a deed, anytime there's a mortgage, or a mortgage gets paid off, anytime there's an agreement with a government agency, like say if the building is subsidized or has Section 8, by law that has to be recorded. It means that it has to be filed with the county clerk. And everything that gets filed with the county clerk gets uploaded to this, to Acris. So you can search by address, you can search by name, and you can find any transaction, any occurrence that happened for your building or that happened for uh, your building owner. You can look and see what other buildings your landlord owns by searching by name. And just looking down here, if you look at the third column from the left of this example, um, you see that these are the kinds of documents you can see there, right? A mortgage, an assignment of mortgage. It means that the bank sold the mortgage to someone else. You can see a bunch of deeds. You can see some agreements. And if you look at those, you can get into the weeds on exactly how much the landlord's mortgage is, whether it's changed, when they have to pay it off, who's the bank that holds it. And you can also see the history of ownership of the building. And not always, but most of the time, you can see how much was paid when the building got sold. On the lower left corner of the screen, that is a partial example of what a deed looks like. On Acris, you can click on the documents and they will open up an actual scan of the document that people signed when, they sold the building or they took out the mortgage. And so, here, ex for example, is one showing that in April 2016, the building at 1422 Green Avenue in Brooklyn was sold from a man named Aaron Stark to uh, let's see, to a corporation called Green Residence LLC. A handy thing for this also is that number one, the deed always has to list the business address of the parties. So that might help you find other possible addresses where you can actually reach your landlord. And not only that, but when you look at a mortgage document, mortgages have to be signed by individual real humans. A corporation can't sign a mortgage. So if you open up a mortgage document and you flip to the end, you'll find a name of somebody who is high up, at least, in whatever corporation owns your building. Someone, usually the owner, because it's somebody who can agree to a loan on behalf of the corporation. So to the extent that the information on the HPD website might be out of date or it might just take you to a PO box, this is another way that you might be able to find a real person with a real address that you can reach. And as Cooper Square knows very well, you can learn a lot by looking at the details of a mortgage. That's a topic all by itself that we won't go into tonight, but there are a lot of mortgages that are given with the assumption that a landlord is going to very quickly change things in the building, get rid of rent-regulated tenants, jack up the rent roll, and sell the building for a lot more than they bought it for. And you can see that in the mortgage. You can see, for example, that a mortgage has a steep interest rate and the landlord's got to pay it all off in 5 years. And that's an indication of what your landlord intends to do and also, um, you know, the likelihood that they won't be able to do it and they will go into foreclosure. So here's just an example. If you look up Acris, if you do an Acris search by name, fun fact, you can put in celebrity names and find where they live. That is the real Jennifer Hudson, Cyndi Lauper, and Robert De Niro. Those are the actual places that they live. And it is totally healthy that I do this all day long. Okay, moving on to the Department of Finance. In New York City, all tax information, all property tax information is public. So you can go onto the DOF website, you can look up any address, and for that address, you'll find all this fun stuff. History of all their tax charges, all their payments, how much they owe right now. You can also find the city's assessment of the building's property value, which is what the taxes are based on. It's usually going to actually be a bit lower than what it would probably really go for on the market, but it's a pretty good rough estimate of what the building is probably can sell for, given its current setup. You can also find on this not just taxes, but any other money that the landlord owes to the city. So that could be like DOB fines, HPD civil penalties. If the city ever had to do emergency repairs at the building and they still owe money for that, water charges, it all goes in there. And it all builds up. And this is actually the number. This is actually, this is the balance sheet that the city looks at when they decide whether they're gonna try to foreclose on the building because the landlord owes a lot of money to the city. Okay. So far, all of the tools we've been looking at are government websites. But there is an excellent, excellent tool that you may know of if you've been to other of these trainings or just have done your own homework on your building. There is a great organization called Just Fix NYC, and they create apps and online tools for tenants to research their landlords and also to be able to make some kinds of complaints or file some kinds of requests with the city. And they have this fantastic tool called Who Owns What. And what it does is it pulls data from all kinds of city databases, um, the ones that we've talked about, but also some that are not as easy to find and not user friendly and contain lots of raw data, and that most of us would probably not be able to use. They pull live data from that daily, and they combine it so that if you search your address, you can get this composite of all of this information. So, for one thing, they'll find the names that are associated with your building, right? The corporation that owns it, the managing agent, whoever's listed as the head officer for the building, and then it searches for any other properties that those names are attached to. And so you get this really cool map that you see on the left of the screen, um, with a dot for every other property that might be associated with your landlord. And you can click on any of those dots if this was the real screen, and you can find out more about those buildings. This is not perfect. It's never possible to be sure, for example, if the John Smith who owns your building is the same John Smith that owns a building in Harlem. And so this app, Who Owns What, tends to err on the side of including everything it can find. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of those orange dots are your landlord. It could be that some of them just have similar names. Could be that those are buildings that the landlord has owned in the past but doesn't own anymore. And it could be buildings that aren't owned by your landlord at all, but maybe are managed by the same management company, which can be useful for you to know under some circumstances. This Who Owns What also scrapes together a bunch of information about all different kinds of code violations, the number of units in the building, the number of 311 complaints, how many eviction cases have been filed in your building, and that's really rare and not easy to find, although we'll talk about some of the tools you can use for that. How many evictions, because Who Owns What searches the New York City Marshals information. So they get it pretty deep into some of the raw data that the city has. It also will tell you how the number of rent stabilized units in your building has changed over time, how many units have been lost, etc. So Who Owns What is just a great place to start. And it'll give you a list of buildings. It's still on you to check out those buildings and see if they really are owned by your landlord or whether it might be a false positive. But this is so incredibly useful, especially since the good cause eviction law passed, because the coverage of the good cause eviction law depends on how many housing units your landlord owns anywhere in New York State. Right? If they own 10 or more housing units, then you're covered by good cause, unless you're covered already by something else like rent stabilization. Uh, and it's a not trivial project to try to find the other buildings your landlord owns and count up all the units. Who Owns What is a really great start to that. It gives you basically the set of addresses you can look up and see if they're your landlord. It also gives you a pretty good profile. Like you can see, for example, um, do the landlord's other buildings have a similar number of code violations as yours? Or is the landlord maybe treating the different buildings differently? Um, could it be that you have allies in some of the other buildings who are being treated the same way by the landlord? And if you reached out, you might be able to present, a more powerful united front to the landlord. So Who Owns What is great. I really encourage people. It's free. You can go online, you can download an app, and it's super easy to use. It's really, you just click on things, things are what they say they are. Play around with it for a while and see what kinds of things you can find out about your building and your landlord. And this is another kind of screen you can get on Who Owns What. So um, if you take that map that was on the previous screen, and instead of looking at it as a map, you look at it as a list of properties. It looks like this. So, you know, different ways of looking at things depending on what kind of information you want. Okay. The last set of tools we're going to look at are the court system, and how much you can find out about cases that your landlord has brought and cases where people have sued your landlord. Uh, so the first place to look, the New York State court system runs something called e-courts, and in it you can search for just about any case that's been brought in a New York State court, except for family law cases, which are generally not public. You can search either by the name of a party, or we can search by the case number, the index number. In some case, courts, it's called a docket number. And if you search for a name, it'll come back with a list of all the cases in all the courts that involve someone with that name. Um, you do have to, they have different pages and you search differently for different courts. So you could look for all Supreme Court cases at the same time. You could look for all the civil court, housing court cases at the same time. There's yet another site for criminal cases. But it's still pretty easy to use. This on this screen is an example of a search that I did for the name Parkash. People may have heard of Parkash. It's a family that owns a lot of buildings, especially in the Bronx, some in Queens. They're notorious as predatory landlords, as harassing their tenants. They own a lot of buildings. They're extremely active, suing people in housing court. As you can see on the right, that's just one page of the search results. There's actually, I think there were 4 more pages like that just for these guys. So you get, if you look at that uh, results page, you can see it'll tell you what court it was in. It'll tell you who the plaintiff was, who the defendant was. I've blacked that out just so that we don't, to keep tenants' names private. It'll tell you if there's another court date coming up and what that is. And as you can see, the index number and the court date are links. You can click on them and get some more information about what's going on in the case. But for the most part, through e-courts, you'll find out who the parties are, who the judge is, when there have been court dates, and the status of the case. But you might not be able to see any of the documents or what the case is about. But e-courts is great just for seeing the activity and for figuring out if a case is live, when it's going to be in court next and what's supposed to happen that day. So it's can be very useful to search for your landlord's name. One thing about this search, it's not a real sophisticated search, so it's not one of those searches that'll find all the results that are similar to your landlord. So you're probably going to want to search, put in different versions, right? So for example, if they sometimes file as, avenue and sometimes as av and sometimes as av with a period, eCourts doesn't, it's not a sophisticated search that will find all of those. So you have to search for each version. Okay. If you really want to get to the good stuff of a lawsuit, though, you want to check out NICEF, which is the New York State Court Electronic Filing. By now, pretty much all courts use this. It used to be only the Supreme Court, but now Housing Court uses it, Civil Court uses it. And this is, now when people file a lawsuit or they file papers in a lawsuit, they usually upload it. And so it's all on there. And so you can, just like eCourts, you can search by name of the parties. You can search by index number if you know that. On the left is, for example, search results when I searched for Parkash, right? But unlike eCourts, if you click on a case here, you get what you see on the right. And here you see a list of documents that have been filed in this case, right? This is a housing court eviction case. You can see the petition, you can see the answer, you can see number 6, a decision that the judge made. You can see number 7, that the tenant filed an order to show cause. And if you click on those things, you'll see the actual documents. So now you're getting into the nitty-gritty. You know what the landlord said they were suing about. You know what defenses the tenant raised. You might be able to see what the judge ruled. So now you can really get into things that your landlord is saying in court. And you can really get into things that other tenants have argued that you might not know about. And this will also include HP actions, so actions that tenants file against the landlord. You can see what conditions they were experiencing that they sued over and what happened in the case and what the judge found to be true. So here you're actually getting into actual stories about what's going on in the building or in other buildings. The actual things that people are experiencing, the arguments that they're having. And this is just invaluable. And it's only in the last few years that housing court cases have been on NICEF. It was sped along by the pandemic when there was an increase in just all kinds of remote court interactions. And now, anytime a case is filed by a lawyer in housing court, it has to be electronically filed like this. Though they will still have to serve papers on the tenant, but it'll be here. And it's all public unless there's some reason that a judge has sealed it. To use NICEF, it helps to create an account, but you can create a free account. You can create alerts for yourself so that you can see when something new happens in a case. Um, you can you can also, and this is interesting, you can also search by lawyer. You'll return a huge number of results because we all know that most of the landlords law firms in housing court are eviction mills and they're filing 50 cases a day. But if you're involved in a court case with your landlord, you might want to know who, how many cases this law firm is filing. Do they tend to say the same thing or make the same lies that they did in your case? So NICEF, it's not quite as fun as looking up celebrities on Acris, but in the sense that Judge Judy is fun, NICEF is kind of fun. You can look at, what tenants had to say back to their landlords and, what judges thought about that. And finally, the New York Department of State has a database of every corporation that's registered in the state, right? So in order to sue or bring a lawsuit, a corporation has to be registered with the New York Department of State, even if it's an out-of-state corporation, even if it's incorporated in Delaware. If they want to be active in New York and they want to be able to bring lawsuits in New York, they have to register, which means you can search any corporation by name or part of name, and it'll give you these results, and you can find out some basic information about corporations. And so, sticking with our Parcash theme, this screen is the results when I did a search just for the word Parcash. And you can see, for example, Parcash has, a couple dozen LLCs, one for each building that they own. And this is, if you click on one of those corporations, this is what the kind of information you get. Um, for LLCs, limited liability corporations, which is usually the kind of corporation that landlords create to own buildings, the information is really bare. And what's notably missing is the name of the people behind the LLC. As of now, there just is no public access to that information, unfortunately. But you can get the history of the corporation, when it was first incorporated, if it's no longer active, when it got shut down, and there'll be an address, as you can see, down in the first box that's got a gray bar at the top, right? It gives an address, but unfortunately, that address is usually not so useful. Most corporations just give the address either of a law office that, you know, uh, collect service for them, or sometimes even just another corporation whose job is just to maintain this address. So um, it's useful to look up in this database because it could at least give you the timeline of when the corporation existed. And sometimes you will see that, in fact, the corporation is no longer active. It was shut down. And that could be an important thing if they're still going around suing people in housing court. I should add, in 2022, the New York State Legislature passed a, a law called the LLC Transparency Act that requires LLCs to file with the government the names of every person who's an owner or a part owner of that LLC. And the law required that this all go into a public database. Unfortunately, in 2023, in response to lobbyists, they amended the law so that that database will no longer be visible to the public and will only be visible to the government. Um, that database isn't set to go online until 2026. And when it does, we'll be able to do a deeper dive into it. It's still going to be useful to us because even though it's not visible to the public, you'll be able to subpoena information from it if you're in court. Anyway, we don't yet know what that's going to look like, but it is going to be, right now that information just doesn't even exist anywhere. So it is a step forward that it'll at least exist, even if we have to fight and come up with clever ways to get our hands on it. Okay, so these are the links to everything that we've talked about tonight. And again, we'll be distributing these slides, so you don't have to write this down. All right, that was a lot of talking by me. So I'm interested in hearing from you uh, what questions you might have, but I'm also interested to hear from you about experiences you've had researching your landlord, tips you've picked up, resources that you know of that I didn't talk about, because I know there are others out there, um, including there is, if you're feeling confident, there is a website called NYC Open Data, which is where there are just a ton of just raw data that the government generates. It's not very easy to use, but if you're feeling up to it, you can learn some interesting things by poking around in it. So, yeah, love to hear if people have questions, if people have experiences they want to share, tips, um, other tools. Yeah.